Hey guys, tonight we begin with a tale of romance, revenge, royal drama, and just a pinch of necrophilia, but tastefully implied. Of course, picture yourself in the lush green hills of 14th century Portugal, the sun setting over the tiled rooftops of Coimbra. Doves are cooing from church towers, and somewhere in the distance, a prince is falling helplessly in love. You know, the usual medieval fairy tale. Except it ends with a beheading, a corpse dug up in royal robes, and a king forcing nobles to kiss a dead woman's hand. Sleep well. Right, so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's fun to imagine us all gathered around a virtual, medieval fire pit. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the Portuguese court in the year 1340. You don't wear perfume, you wear dust and politics. You serve as a noble, which mostly means watching other people fall in love badly, while you silently hope you don't get executed for breathing at the wrong time. The drama begins when a young Castilian noblewoman named Inés de Castro is sent to Portugal as lady-in-waiting to Princess Constanza. That's Peter's wife, Prince Peter, the future king, the guy who's about to ruin absolutely everyone's lives, including his own. Now, Peter is married, let's get that out of the way. But medieval marriage isn't about love. It's about alliances, dowries, and who can produce the healthiest heir without dying in childbirth. And, unfortunately, Constanza is fragile, historically. It's unclear whether she was sickly from the start, or if she simply realised her husband was wildly in love with her handmaid. But either way, things weren't going great in the palace bedroom. Then there's Inés. She's beautiful, clever, and politically inconvenient. Her brothers are powerful nobles in Castile, and they whisper too often in Peter's ear. That makes the Portuguese court nervous. You see it in the narrowed glances from King Alfonso IV. Peter's father, who is not a fan of his son's emotional decisions, especially when those emotions result in 4 illegitimate children and a refusal to marry anyone else after his legal wife dies. Constanza dies in 1345 in childbirth. Because of course, and if you're hoping Peter might finally act like a respectable royal, nope, he doubles down. He moves Inés into the royal estate at Coimbra, and they live together openly. It's not just scandalous, it's dangerous. Not just because of the court, but because in medieval politics, the line between mistress and queen is more than a title, it's a declaration of war. Now here's where things go from uncomfortable to Shakespearean tragedy. Centuries before Shakespeare was born, Peter claims that he and Inés secretly marry. No paperwork, no witnesses except maybe a goose and a suspicious priest. But Peter swears it happened. Historians still argue whether it's true. Was it real? Was it invented later to justify the bizarre events that followed? Either way, it didn't stop the king from snapping. King Alfonso IV sees all this the growing power of Inés's Castilian relatives, Peter's obsession, and the inconvenient fact that Peter refuses to remarry and produce a legitimate heir and decides that enough is enough. He gathers his advisors. They lean in close, the mood darkens. Then he gives the order, assassinate Inés de Castro. You don't just kill the prince's mistress without expecting consequences. But Alfonso thinks he's solving a problem. Instead, he creates a legend. Soldiers ride to Coimbra. They find Inés with her children. And in a moment that medieval poets later describe, with dramatically weepy ink and far too many metaphors involving roses and blood. They execute her. One version says she's beheaded in a courtyard. Another says it happens indoors. in front of her young son, which is either poetic exaggeration or a level of cruelty only medieval nobles could manage before breakfast. The thing is, Peter doesn't forget. He doesn't move on. He doesn't forgive. He seethes. He waits. When Alfonso dies in 1357, Peter becomes King of Portugal. He does not begin his reign with a grand speech or a parade. No, he starts with a vengeance tour. He captures 2 of Inez's killers, just 2. The third one fled to France. Smart man. Peter doesn't execute them quickly. That would be merciful. Instead, he has their hearts ripped from their chests. Why? Because, he says, they didn't deserve hearts when they had crushed his. Now, most kings might stop there, but Peter has flair. He wants the world to remember this love. He wants the court to feel it, physically. He orders Inez's body exhumed. Keep in mind, she's been dead for years. They dress her in royal robes, they place a crown on her head, then they carry her into the throne room, and every noble in court is required to kneel and kiss her hand in fealty. That's right, you're a baron in 1360s Portugal, and you're kissing the decaying hand of a dead queen while trying not to retch into your ruffled sleeves. It's either the most romantic gesture in medieval history or the most disturbing royal flex ever performed with a corpse. Possibly both. Peter ensures she's buried in splendour, her tomb placed in the monastery of Alcobaça, facing his own, so that on Judgment Day, when the dead rise, they'll look into each other's eyes, because nothing says eternal love like a strategic burial plan. Today, their tombs still stand, ornate, white stone carved with angels, lions, and medieval sadness tourists visit. They whisper the legend. Some call it tragic, others call it beautiful. But you, standing here in this dim candlelight of story, can't help but wonder, was it love or obsession? Was Peter a heartbroken husband or a king who couldn't accept fate? Historians still debate, poets still write, but all agree on one thing: Peter's passion for Inez didn't die with her. It rose, dressed her in a crown, and made the entire kingdom kneel before it, and as the dust settles on Inez's royal robes. The next story creeps in a tale not of tragic romance, but of absurd thrift, a miserly ferryman, and a plan to fake his own death to avoid buying dinner. You know, some people say that money can't buy happiness, but if you asked John Overs, a ferryman from medieval London, he'd probably have a few words to say about that, except he'd probably want to avoid paying for them. Why? Well, John was an extreme saver, the kind of guy who could teach seminars on penny pinching, had he not spent all his time being, well, kind of terrible. Let's back up a bit. Imagine it's the 11th century. London's a bit rough around the edges, but it's growing. John, a man of humble origins, runs a ferry across the Thames, which sounds idyllic, right? A nice little job, crossing the river, maybe chatting with a few travellers. Nope. John had a monopoly on the ferry route, which meant he was cashing in on every single crossing. And did he enjoy his newfound wealth? Not exactly. You see, he was the kind of miser who looked at a coin and flinched, like it was somehow going to bite him. Now, you've probably met someone like this, the person who won't tip at a coffee shop, because they don't believe in wasting money on luxuries. But John took this philosophy to such extremes that it was almost impressive. If it weren't so sad, he didn't just save pennies, he pinched them. He'd skimp on food, living off stale bread and rotten bones, which he might charitably offer to his servants and apprentices, but to save a penny. Forget it. John was determined to avoid eating anything that wasn't as bland as the inside of a stone wall. But he had a soft spot, just one for his daughter. His daughter, you see, was an innocent bystander in this whole ridiculous plan. She was lovely, pious, and beautiful, and despite his tight-fisted ways, John cared for her deeply. He made sure she received an education, or at least as much of an education as you can get while still living in a world where personal hygiene is practically unheard of and no one knows how to read a map. But there was just one problem. John was too busy hoarding money and avoiding meals to spend much time with his beloved child. So what did he do to show her he cared? Well, one evening, John had a brilliant idea, a stroke of genius, really. He'd pretend to be dead. You see, he figured if he could make his servants think he'd passed away, they'd be so upset they'd skip a meal. This, in his mind, would be the ultimate saving strategy. And what better way to save on food than having an impromptu funeral for yourself? Who needs dinner when your servants are too sad to eat? Perfect, right? John lay on his bed, feigning death with as much drama as a medieval miser could muster. His daughter, looking on with an air of resignation, because, let's face it, she probably had to clean his room anyway, wrapped him in a burial shroud. Then the act began. His servants, hearing the news of his death, were so delighted at the prospect of an unscheduled day off that they immediately threw a party. There was music, there was dancing, there was food, delicious food that John, the man who lived off stale bread, had no intention of buying for himself. At this point, John was still lying in his shroud, stewing in righteous indignation, knowing full well that the whole charade was supposed to be his moment to shine. But then, reality took a turn for the worst. One of his servants, getting a bit too carried away with the celebrations, took it upon themselves to investigate whether John's corpse was, in fact, real. Well, needless to say, John's reappearance was less of a miraculous resurrection, and more of a slightly panicked man trying to free himself from a burial shroud. The scene that followed was chaotic. John, struggling to break free from the cloth, looked every bit the part of an angry ghost, or perhaps the embodiment of death itself. His servant, in sheer panic, thought this might be some kind of demonic uprising, and proceeded to do the only sensible thing available to them. In the moment, beat the living daylights out of John with the butt end of a broken oar. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could this get any worse? But it does. John, in his desperation to actually be alive again, struggles with even greater intensity. His servants more convinced than ever that the devil himself was rising from the grave. They beat John to death with an oar, the same oar that would have, ironically, been used to navigate him across the Thames in Cardiff. John, of course, dies, and because he's already been excommunicated from the church, something to do with that pesky issue of usury. There's no chance for a proper Christian burial. His daughter, heartbroken and desperate to fulfill her father's final wishes, however confusing, bribes a monastery to take care of his body. But that's where the real fun begins. Once the monks realise who John is and, let's be honest, probably how he got there, they dig him up and, in the finest medieval fashion, throw his body on the back of a donkey. The donkey, who probably just wanted to spend the day being a donkey, has no idea what it's transporting. The donkey wanders through London, doing what donkeys do best, wandering until it ends up at the place where the criminals were executed. And there it is, the final indignity of John's life. His body is dumped right there, beneath the gallows, with the executioners going about their day, probably cracking jokes about how nobody ever thinks to give donkeys the day off. But it doesn't stop there. John's legacy, his life's work, of being utterly impossible to deal with lives on, his daughter, in an ironic twist of fate, decides that maybe, just maybe, the best thing to do with her father's wealth is to give it all away to charity. What was once tightly guarded, miserly hoarded, is now flowing freely in the hands of people who actually need it. Historians will never know if this was some grand philosophical gesture on John's part. A final lesson to us all about the futility of wealth accumulation, or simply an act of unintentional comedy that only the Middle Ages could produce. Either way, John Overs went from miser to martyr in the blink of an eye, and his legacy as the worst miser in medieval history continues to baffle and entertain. And just when you think the world has gone as mad as it can, here's a tale that will make you seriously question whether we've actually learned anything from history. At all, a story of royal ambition, tragic miscalculations, and a family drama so intense it could only have happened in the shadow of an empire. Ah, the drama of the royal court. It's all opulent gowns, jewelled crowns, and wait for it, horrifyingly bad decisions that ruin entire bloodlines. Well, this story has all that and more. Now, picture yourself in 1120 sailing back to England on a lavish royal vessel, the White Ship. No, it's not an actual luxury cruise, in fact. It's more like a floating disaster waiting to happen. You're surrounded by a mix of noble knights, ladies, and hangers-on, along with an ample supply of wine, because nothing says perfect voyage like an overindulgence in booze and bad decision-making. As you shuffle past the draped curtains of the ship's deck, you might catch sight of a young, somewhat tipsy prince, William Adelin, heir to the English throne. He's in a jovial mood, likely buoyed by the promise of home. He just came from Normandy. After all, but there's something off. The ship is a little too crowded, a little too noisy, and it's been delayed for hours. But who cares about little things like safety when there's wine to be had? The young prince had one task that evening: get back to England safely, but instead, he's busy ensuring the entire ship is filled with the kind of chaos you'd expect from a high school prom. Except everyone is a noble, and they've all been drinking like there's no tomorrow. Spoiler alert, there isn't. Historians are still unsure exactly what caused it. Some say it was a navigational error. Others say it was the weight of so many drunken nobles in such a small ship. But in the early hours of the night, tragedy strikes the White. Ship strikes a rock. And just like that, the night goes from drunken merriment to absolute disaster. The ship begins to sink, and chaos ensues. Everyone is scrambling for their lives, splashing in the icy cold waters of the English Channel. But of course, it's not that simple, is it? In the chaos, Prince William might have survived. You know, had he not gone back for his half-sister Matilda in what's essentially the most gallant yet disastrous decision of the night. William turns back to rescue her, completely ignoring the fact that the ship is sinking like a stone. His bravery is cut short as his boat is swamped, and the prince, along with the rest of the drowning passengers, is swallowed up by the water. It's the kind of tragic heroism that Shakespeare would later love to sink his teeth into, but for now, it's just tragic. Of the 300 passengers on board, only one survives. One, a French butcher. Yes, you heard that right, a French butcher. If this doesn't seem like the universe's cruelest joke, I don't know what does. This man clung to a rock and, somehow, lived to tell the tale. Meanwhile, the heir to the throne of England, along with his nobles, knights, and family, are now fish food. It's a catastrophe on such a grand scale that it sends shockwaves through the English monarchy, and yet, no one can really blame the butcher. He wasn't exactly lucky to survive. After all, most of his fellow passengers were probably still too drunk to grasp the severity of the situation before the ship went down. It wasn't so much fate as it was sheer luck. He just happened to be near the edge of the ship and managed to swim to a rock while everyone else sank beneath the waves. It wasn't bravery or quick thinking. It was random, pure, and utterly absurd. Now, you might think that's the end of the story. The ship goes down, the prince dies, and the world moves on. Except remember, this is medieval history, and when you're talking about the heir to the English throne, dying in such a ridiculous way, you don't just move on, you create a mess that echoes through generations. For King Henry I, the death of his only male heir is a catastrophe. This wasn't just a tragic loss for the royal family. This was a political crisis of the highest order. The throne of England now hangs in the balance, in the chaos that follows. England is plunged into what would later be called the anarchy, a civil war lasting nearly 15 years. All because one prince was drunk, went back to save his half-sister, and forgot the cardinal rule of survival. Don't go down with the ship. The entire kingdom teeters on the brink of chaos, as a result of a single poorly timed decision made in the depths of inebriation. Historians still argue about the impact of this event. Was the White Ship tragedy truly the beginning of the anarchy that would consume England for the next decade and a half, or was it merely the match to the powder keg of a country already on the verge of fracturing? Regardless, one thing is clear. The death of William Adelin set off a chain of events that led to one of the most brutal and disorganised periods in English history. And here you are, sitting at the edge of this story, realising that you've barely had time to process the ridiculousness of it all. The prince, in all his pomp and circumstance, drowned in the cold waters of the Channel, all while the butcher gets to go back to his everyday life, slicing meat and making sausages. It's almost as though history can't help but turn every high-stakes moment into absurd theatre. But perhaps this ridiculousness is just a preview of the other oddities the Middle Ages have to offer. You'd think you've heard it all by now. But, as we both know, there are always more bizarre tales waiting to unfold. And as fate would have it, the next story is just as strange as the last. Imagine this: two children, found in a small English village, both with skin a strange shade of green, speaking a language no one understands. They don't eat anything except green beans, and when they finally do, their skin turns a less alien shade. Are they fairies, time travellers, or just two very malnourished children who got lost? You're about to find out. It's the 12th century, and you find yourself standing in the middle of the village of Woolpit in the heart of Suffolk. England. It's a place with muddy streets and humble homes, where the occasional sheep crosses your path, and the most exciting event of the year is probably the local harvest festival. You're having a slow, uneventful day, when suddenly, bam, you're introduced to the strangest mystery you'll ever encounter in your entire life. Two children, not just any children. These kids, well, let's just say they're not quite like anything you've seen before. They show up in Woolpit, but they're not from around here. They don't speak your language. And when they arrive, they're, well, green. Yes, green. Their skin has this unmistakable, unearthly hue, like they've been dipped in some sort of mystical green paint. But it's not just their skin that's weird. Their clothes absolutely bizarre. They're dressed in clothes that no one in the village has ever seen before. Clothes that look foreign, possibly from a land that might not even exist in this world. Now, let's talk about the behaviour. These kids, two of them, a boy and a girl, refuse to eat anything. Not bread, not cheese, not even the tasty stew bubbling away in the village kitchen. They refuse, all except for one thing: green beans. Yes, green beans, apparently. That's the only food they'll touch. Can you imagine if you're in medieval England, where most food is about as appetising as a wet sock? The idea of kids eating only green beans seems almost too neat. But then something even stranger happens. These children, who had once been as green as a meadow in spring, start to change, and after they've been fed some green beans, their skin begins to lose its strange tint over time. They become normal, or at least more normal, certainly less green. But while they may now blend into the crowd, there's still something fundamentally off about them. They didn't just come out of nowhere, and they didn't just change because of some strange dietary miracle. Oh no, there's more. The children eventually begin to speak, though they speak in a language that no one understands, naturally. The villagers are freaked out. Not only do these kids look like they've just walked off the set of a fairy tale, but they've also never heard anyone speak like this before. They're foreign, and not just in the way that someone from across the sea might be, but otherworldly. Like they're from a world where the very concept of language is twisted, warped, and utterly alien. The mystery deepens as the children are taken in by a local man, Sir Richard de Calne, who gives them shelter, and after some time, the children start to explain well, as much as they can in their strange newfound language. They tell the villagers that they come from a place called St. Martin's Land, a place where the sun never rises, a land of eternal twilight, where there's no daylight, just an endless, dim, greyish glow, a place that's separated from ours by a wide, fast-flowing river. And when asked how they came to be here, they tell the villagers that they were out in the fields, tending to their father's sheep, when they heard a sound aloud, church bell-like ringing, and then, suddenly, they were here, in Woolpit. So, there you are, standing in the middle of this ridiculous story, wondering what in the world is going on. These kids have no idea where they came from. They're speaking in a language no one understands, and they're describing a place that might as well be on Mars for all anyone can fathom. A land with no sun, no daylight, just twilight. They're saying it all with such calm, innocent faces that it's almost easier to believe that they are something other than just lost children. Now, some people think that this story is nothing more than medieval folklore, a tall tale passed down through the generations, exaggerated over time to capture the imagination. Some historians believe that the children may have been suffering from some form of malnutrition, or perhaps a disease that caused their skin to appear green. Maybe they had a rare condition known as chlorosis, which causes a greenish tint to the skin due to iron deficiency. But even that doesn't explain the strange language they spoke, or their bizarre clothing. And don't even get started on the no sun, twilight world bit, that's a real head scratcher. The mystery of the green children of Woolpit has baffled historians, folklorists, and anthropologists for centuries. Were they aliens, perhaps time travellers, inexplicably displaced in time and space? Some people even claim they were fairies or creatures from an alternate dimension, and the strange ringing they heard was a portal opening between worlds. Others have suggested that the children were simply lost travellers from a far-off land who had become separated from their parents and were so malnourished that they looked like they came from another world. But perhaps the most widely accepted explanation, however, is that the children were, in fact, just victims of medieval life. The Middle Ages were rife with illness, famine, and disease. The children might have been separated from their parents and were found near Woolpit, exhausted, malnourished, and wearing strange clothing that didn't fit into the local style. The fact that they couldn't speak English could simply be the result of cultural differences, and the green colour of their skin might have been caused by a lack of proper nutrition, or even lead poisoning from the cheap materials used in their clothing. And yet, there's something undeniably magical about the story, something that resists explanation. Why would the children speak of a world with no sunlight, a twilight realm? How did they get to Woolpit in the first place? And why did they suddenly start eating only green beans? Theories come and go, but no one can truly explain it away. But perhaps it's better that way. Maybe the green children of Woolpit are meant to remain as they are, strange, unknowable, and a reminder of how, sometimes, history gets stranger than anything fiction could dream up. And speaking of mysteries, let's move on to another story, this one a little darker. It's about a man who thought he had an ironclad plan to avoid a very medieval fate, being buried alive. What could possibly go wrong when you fake your own death for the sake of a few coins, now that we've had a taste of strange children from far-off lands and their otherworldly adventures. Let's dive into something equally bizarre, though this time it's all about a man's peculiar idea of saving a few coins. It's the 11th century, and our next character, John Overs, has a problem. He's far too rich for his own good, but he refuses to enjoy a single penny of it. He's the kind of man who wouldn't buy a proper meal for himself if he could avoid it. He doesn't need the luxuries of life. Forget feasts or comforts, this man is so tight. You could probably hear him squeak from miles away. John is a ferryman by trade, which sounds simple enough, but in the 11th century, ferrying people across the Thames was a fairly lucrative business. John doesn't have to work too hard. His monopoly on the ferry route earns him enough to live comfortably. But John wants to be more than comfortable. He wants to be rich, as in lock my coins in the basement and slap a do not disturb, sign on my wealth kind of rich. And with this desire to hoard comes an idea, a truly terrible, almost comical idea. You see, John's mind is a labyrinth of Scrooge-like strategies. He's looking for a way to cut back on his expenses, even if it means going to extreme lengths. So, what does he do? He decides to fake his own death. Now, in case you're wondering, no, this isn't some grand heist plot. John doesn't have any grand ambitions of escaping to the Caribbean with his ill-gotten gains. Instead, he comes up with an ingenious idea. He'll fake his death, and in doing so, he'll trick his servants into feeling so mournful that they'll skip a meal out of pure grief. He thinks, why buy dinner for the staff when I can simply make them feel sad enough not to eat? It sounds like a terrible plan to anyone with any semblance of sanity, but to John, it makes perfect sense. Here's how it goes. He gets himself wrapped up in a burial shroud, lies on his bed, and goes completely still. He fakes the most dramatic, lifeless posture he can muster. The kind of posture that even a funeral director would say. This man is really committed to the bit. It's all for one purpose, to get the servants to believe he's dead, mourn his passing, and voila, skip a meal. He's saving money and food, and his servants are none the wiser. But here's where the comedy kicks in. John's servants, bless their hearts, aren't so heartbroken as he'd hoped. In fact, the moment they hear of his passing, they're positively elated. This wasn't just a hey, I'll miss him moment. Oh no. The servants, to put it politely, start a party. Not just any party, mind you, but a full-fledged feast of meats, breads and ale, all in celebration of their freedom from John's miserly rule. The poor man had no idea that the mourners in his home were actually throwing a celebratory bash at his expense, if he could have seen it. He'd have realised that his own plan, designed to save money, had backfired on a cosmic scale. As John lies there, his deathly still body pretending to rest peacefully, he has no idea that the party of the century is happening just a few rooms over. His servants are drinking, laughing, and eating the lavish meals John had always denied them. They don't seem to care much about the supposed tragedy that's taken place. Instead, they revel in the fact that they don't have to follow John's stingy rules for one blessed night. And then, the most absurd thing happens. John decides to wake up. Not like slowly, not in a dainty, oh, I'm just taking a nap kind of way. No, John's grand reappearance is nothing short of dramatic. He struggles to free himself from the burial shroud, grunting and pulling at the cloth in a frantic, almost comical manner. He's trying to make his grand return from the dead, but unfortunately, his re-emergence is not met with awe or reverence. It's met with confusion, terror, and, well, the inevitable panic of his servants. The people who had just been celebrating his death now have to deal with a very alive, very angry John Overs. And in a world that's already a little too prone to superstition and paranoia, they don't exactly react well. One of the servants, in sheer panic, does what anyone would do in this situation. He mistakes John for a ghost. Not just any ghost, mind you, but a vengeful ghost. And what do you do when you think you're facing the wrath of a ghost, especially one that you've spent the day celebrating the death of? You smack it with the nearest heavy object, of course. And for this servant, the nearest object just happens to be a broken oar. Yes, you read that right. John's big return to life is met by a violent whack with an oar. Now, some might call this overkill, and they'd be right. But for the servant, in his panic-stricken state, it makes sense. He believes he's being haunted by the ghost of a miserly, money-hoarding ferryman, and he's got to fend it off. So, he gives John a few hearty whacks to the head with the oar. Now, John's struggle is no longer about escaping a burial shroud. It's about not dying twice in one day, unfortunately for him. He's too slow to get away. The oar lands a few too many times, and poor John is dead for real this time. You'd think he'd be relieved at least, but no, he's the victim of a ridiculous and probably a little karmic fate. His death is a tragic one, but for the medieval world, it's also a lesson, and that lesson, dear listener, is not just about the dangers of being miserly. It's a reminder that when you plan to cheat death for a few extra coins, it's probably not a good idea to involve your servants in your plot, especially when your servants are armed with oars and have a vivid imagination. But of course, things don't end there. No, after John's second death, the real one, his daughter, in a move that is both heartfelt and completely baffling, decides to give away all of his money. That's right, all of it. The money that John had hoarded so fiercely during his life. Money he had never shared. Not even for food or comfort was suddenly poured out like it was nothing. John's daughter bribes a monastery to take care of her father's body, and then, feeling guilty perhaps for having such a miserly father, she proceeds to give all of his accumulated wealth to charity. I'm sure John would have loved to see that. Right, too bad he was busy being dead, but who can blame her? What better way to spend your inherited fortune than to right the wrongs of a father who never bothered to give a coin to anyone, even in the afterlife? And so, John's legacy, his infamous legacy, is sealed not by his hoarding, not by his greed, but by his daughter's decision to wipe the slate clean in a bizarre twist of fate. John goes from a miserly ferryman to an unwitting philanthropist, all because he couldn't resist the urge to save just one more coin. But even as his wealth is redistributed to the needy, you can't help but feel that the world is a little bit lighter for it. After all, when your whole life revolves around hoarding every penny, it's nice to see that even the most miserly souls can leave behind something more than just piles of gold and a tarnished reputation. Now, as you sit back and reflect on John's absurd and ultimately tragic tale, you might wonder, was it greed that led to his downfall? Or was it simply a case of not knowing when to stop? Well, my friend, that's a question we'll explore as we move on to the next story. And trust me, this one is going to be just as strange, if not stranger. But before we do that, let me tell you about something that will make you question whether you really want to travel back in time to the 12th century. Because this next tale is about to turn the medieval world on its head. There's a peculiar, almost grim fascination with how the past reveals just how much we, as a species, have learned, or in some cases, how much we still haven't. Take the story of the White Ship, for example, and the absolutely ludicrous events that led to a shipwreck and the death of Prince William Adelin. Sure, it's a tragedy, but in hindsight, the absurdity of it all, the wine, the chaos, the prince's self-destructive heroism is almost too much to ignore. Now, let's take a step back and think about life in medieval England. Picture yourself walking through a busy town square, a group of men in worn leather armour exchanging rumours. and women hustling with baskets of vegetables. The smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. There's an uncomfortable truth that runs through the core of this world just beneath the surface, where the myths and legends collide with the gritty, everyday reality of living in a time where life expectancy hovered around 35 if you were one of the lucky ones. That is, but more often than not, death was a constant companion, lurking around every corner. This was a time when illness wasn't explained by bacteria or viruses, but by something far more terrifying, divine retribution. In the 12th century, people didn't think, oh, I caught a cold, better drink some tea and rest. No, when someone got sick, they were usually told by the priest that they had angered the gods, broken a taboo, or, worst of all, brought shame upon their family. And as if that weren't enough, if you were unlucky enough to catch something serious, like, say, a plague, you'd be lucky to even know what it was that was taking you down. But let's not just focus on the bad, because in the midst of all this sickness, death, and superstition, there was something that people did something that's actually kind of strange. Considering how deadly the era was, people still threw parties. Not just any parties. They threw banquets. And those banquets weren't just about food. They were about theatre. No, really. They'd spend hours at a time in massive public gatherings, eating and drinking wine that was often diluted to the point of being nothing more than flavoured water. That's right, people in the Middle Ages were so used to a constant lack of food, they made a spectacle out of every meal. And while people were dancing, feasting, and tossing back wine, there was still a looming sense that they were living on borrowed time. So when you were invited to a banquet in those days, it wasn't just an invitation to eat, it was a reminder that your life could end at any moment, in a random, tragic way, like being struck by a disease, a sudden accident, or worse, by the wrath of a god who didn't appreciate how you'd sacrificed that goat last month. People had to face that kind of uncertainty every day, but instead of becoming paralysed by it, they celebrated. It was the only way to stay sane. Speaking of staying sane, let's shift gears a bit and talk about binge drinking. Yes, you read that right, because if there's one thing that the medieval world did well, it was drinking, and, apparently, the more you drank, the closer you got to death. Not in the usual drinking and driving way. Mind you, this was medieval England, where the idea of binge drinking wasn't just an excuse to have fun, it was practically a rite of passage. The more wine you consumed, the more authentically royal you became. And, as it happens, the White Ship tragedy, which we've already discussed, was essentially the result of a huge amount of binge drinking. In 1120, Prince William Adelin, the son of King Henry I, was on his way back to England from Normandy. He was surrounded by noble knights, ladies, servants, and soldiers, all of whom were far too eager to engage in the tradition of overindulgence that had come to define this royal happening. As the night went on, more and more wine flowed, and the ship got more crowded. All the noblemen, after all, were celebrating. And when you're celebrating in medieval England, the idea of moderation is, well, not exactly on the agenda. They drank, they partied, and they completely ignored the fact that their ship was crowded to the point of sinking. Imagine being on that ship, surrounded by intoxicated revellers, while everyone else around you seems oblivious to the impending disaster. You can hear the laughter and see the clinking of wine goblets. There's no talk of safety. No one's watching out for the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It's all fun and games, until bam, the ship strikes a rock, just like that. The night of revelry turns into a full-blown catastrophe. And here's where the true absurdity lies. Prince William, who could have simply saved himself by hopping onto one of the lifeboats and getting out of harm's way, goes back for his half-sister Matilda. His decision to turn around is a mix of gallantry and tragic foolishness. He doesn't consider the obvious danger. He simply acts in the name of family, of duty, and perhaps a little bit of drunken heroism. But the best part, or perhaps the worst part, depending on how you look at it, is that his decision to turn back is the very thing that seals his fate. The boat he's in becomes swamped by the waves, and in a few short minutes, the prince is lost to the water. Of the 300 passengers on board, only one person survives. A French butcher. Imagine that. A butcher, clinging to a rock and living to tell the tale. A tale of absurdity, a tale of fate, a tale of utter madness. What's even crazier is that the butcher wasn't even royal. He was just a guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time. So, what does this tell us about medieval life? Well, aside from the fact that you probably shouldn't drink too much at a royal party and expect to make it to the next day, it tells us that death was always lurking. It could come for you in the form of a shipwreck, a plague, or even just the wrath of a god you didn't please. The more you look into medieval history, the more you realise that life itself was just one long game of will I survive this? It wasn't about long-term plans or lofty goals, it was about endurance, about making it from one day to the next. And yet, amidst all the suffering, people still threw their grand feasts, their lavish banquets, and their boozy celebrations. They drank, they ate, they sang, and they hoped that the next day they'd still be able to wake up and carry on. The more you reflect on this, the more you see how strange and absurd the past was. Life was hard, it was unpredictable, and yet people kept going, kept celebrating, kept surviving, because, after all, what else could they do? It was the only thing that made sense in a world full of death, disease, and poor decisions. And speaking of poor decisions, the next story on our journey involves one of the most bizarre, unexpected consequences of medieval superstition. It's a tale that might sound like something out of a dark comedy, but it's grounded in very real fears. And when you hear it, you'll see just how far people would go to avoid the very thing that was supposed to save them. You might think you know about superstitions, but wait until you hear what happened to a group of 14th century folk who decided that they knew better than their own hygiene standards. Let's take a break from royalty, betrayal, and shipwrecks, and dive into a little tale of superstition and hygiene in the Middle Ages. You're probably thinking, hygiene in the Middle Ages? That's a joke. Right, oh, how right you are. But while hygiene in medieval times was not exactly the glowing example of human advancement that we might hope for, the beliefs about hygiene were, well, fascinating. It's strange to think about. But the Middle Ages were actually obsessed with cleanliness, just not in a way you might imagine. Picture yourself standing in the middle of a crowded medieval village. The air smells of sweat, animals, and the occasional whiff of stale bread. People walk around wearing thick, woolen tunics, their faces smudged with dirt, their feet caked in mud. Personal hygiene, as we know it, wasn't exactly on the agenda. There were no daily showers, no soap that smelled like lavender or roses. Instead, there was the ever so charming routine of cleaning yourself with whatever you could find, and sometimes that meant using things that were best left undisturbed. Now, imagine you're a villager in this medieval world, and you're listening to your local priest talk about cleanliness. According to the clergy, being clean was more than just a matter of basic hygiene. Oh no, to the medieval mind, cleanliness had deep spiritual significance. You see, cleanliness was a way of keeping the body and soul pure. And what better way to do that than by engaging in, well, strange, Medieval practices. One of the most peculiar habits of medieval hygiene involved the use of holy water. This was water that had been blessed by a priest, often used for washing hands or, in some cases, for cleansing the body. In theory, this should have been a great idea after all. Holy water was blessed and therefore could purify you. Right, but here's the catch: most people didn't exactly shower with holy water. They merely sprinkled it on themselves, thinking that this act would cleanse them of sin and keep their bodies pure. It was as if the act of getting wet and hoping for divine intervention was somehow enough to ward off the evils of the world, both physical and spiritual, and this, my friends, was considered advanced hygiene in medieval Europe. But it wasn't just holy water that people believed would purify them. Oh no, there were also mysterious powders and ointments that were believed to purge your skin of bad spirits. Some of these were made from herbs, medicinal herbs, like rosemary and sage, but others were far more dubious. People would mix oils, vinegar, and various concoctions that might cleanse them in some cosmic sense, but likely only left them smelling interesting. And here's where things start to get truly strange. You see, many medieval folks had this odd belief that bathing was somehow sinful. Yes, you read that right. In a world where you couldn't even remember the last time you'd washed. Some believed that bathing was a dangerous act. Why? Because water, they thought, was somehow a gateway to temptation. It's true. Some people thought that bathing, especially communal bathing, might stir up sinful thoughts. After all, if you got too clean, you'd have too much time on your hands to think about sin clearly. The medieval mindset was a complex and, frankly, baffling one. Instead of taking regular baths, many medieval people would clean themselves using an incredibly primitive and, let's be honest, less than appealing method, drying off their skin by rubbing it with cloth. Think of it as a form of cleaning without the actual cleansing part. You just basically rubbed your body down with a rough piece of cloth. And boom clean as can be, this, of course, didn't do much to actually remove dirt or sweat, but it was considered a sufficient solution for personal hygiene. And if you weren't into dry rubbing, there was always the option of smearing yourself with oils. You'd rub the oil into your skin, and voila, you'd have this glistening sheen, though not necessarily of cleanliness. Oil wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. It helped protect your skin from the harsh elements, think biting cold or scorching sun, while also preserving your body in a sense. In a world where the average life expectancy hovered around 35, the idea of preserving your body with oil was seen as a form of protective magic. Keep in mind, the skin wasn't the only thing to preserve. If you could find ways to keep your body relatively free from disease, it was considered as much a spiritual act as a physical one. But here's where the real fun starts. Imagine you've got a medieval bathhouse in your village, where the wealthier folks gather to clean themselves. What do you think happens there? Are they just relaxing with some incense and bath salts? Oh no. My friend, these bathhouses were full of social activity. People didn't just go there to cleanse themselves. They went there to talk about the real important stuff: politics, gossip, rumours, and in some cases, even the stealing of spouses. In fact, many medieval bathhouses were actually havens for criminals, conspirators, and lovers looking to rendezvous. The steamy atmosphere wasn't just good for your pores, it was also great for shady business. So, while we might look at the medieval bathing rituals and laugh or cringe at the complete lack of modern hygiene, you have to understand that these practices were deeply entwined with medieval values. There was a mystical belief in the purity of the body and soul that made people do strange things in the name of cleanliness. A clean body wasn't just a healthy one, it was a spiritual one. In fact, the entire concept of public health was heavily influenced by religious practices, with monasteries and priests often being at the forefront of the push for maintaining a pure body and mind. But let's step back from these oddities for a moment and think about how medieval hygiene impacts us today. Despite their fascinating and rather unpleasant ways of keeping clean, medieval people knew something that we've long forgotten in the modern world. They understood that taking care of your body, however flawed the methods may have been, was tied to taking care of your mind and soul, and that, dear listener, is a lesson we still carry with us today, even if we don't always remember it in the rush of our modern, sanitized lives. And speaking of lessons, let's move on to the next oddball tale from medieval times. This one involves an ancient belief system, a misunderstood legend, and a theory that might just blow your mind, especially if you've ever thought the moon was made of cheese. Intrigued you should be, because the next chapter involves an epic tale of strange beliefs, and the age-old debate, was the moon made of cheese? Or was there something far stranger going on? Alright, let's talk about something that's so mind-bending, so strange. It could only have originated in the Middle Ages. You know that old joke about the moon being made of green cheese? Well, if you think that's just some goofy thing we say to laugh at our ancestors, then strap in, because we're about to dive into one of the weirdest tales to come out of medieval England. It's the story of two children, yes, two strange green children who popped up out of nowhere and completely defied all logic and understanding. And no, we're not talking about Martians. This isn't some sci-fi tale. It's a real-life mystery that left medieval England scratching its head for centuries. Let's set the scene. It's somewhere around the 12th century, and you're walking down the dusty, cobbled streets of Woolpit, a small village in Suffolk, England. Picture the idyllic country life. Farmers working in the fields, the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air, and the sound of livestock calling from nearby pens. It's the kind of peaceful, quiet place you'd expect in a medieval English village. But then, out of nowhere, two children appear. And these weren't just any children. No, these two were strange in every way that counted. The first odd thing about them: their skin, it was green. Yes, green. And no, this wasn't some kind of strange metaphorical description from a medieval storyteller. It was a literal description. The children's skin was so green it could have been mistaken for a walking patch of grass. Not a gentle green, mind you, but an unnatural, otherworldly green. But it wasn't just their colour that had the village buzzing with confusion. No, the real mystery lay in their behaviour. These kids didn't speak the language of the villagers. They weren't fluent in English or whatever the local dialect was. Instead, they spoke in a language no one recognised, as if they came from a far-off place where the words sounded completely alien. When they were brought to the home of Sir Richard de Calne, the local lord, the children refused to eat any food that was offered to them for days. They wouldn't touch anything at all, which is pretty unusual for kids, especially in a world where food was scarce. So, what did they eat? Well, these two strange, green-skinned children only ate one thing: green beans. Yes, you read that right. Green beans. Not just a strange preference, but an actual necessity. The children would refuse any food, but as soon as they were presented with a dish of green beans, they'd devour them with apparent delight. It's like they came from a world where green beans were the only food that existed, and nothing else would do. As they were given more food and began to adjust to the village, their skin started to lose that strange hue. Slowly but surely, the greenish tint faded, and they started to resemble regular, albeit strange, children. But that wasn't the end of the oddities. Their story just kept getting weirder, eventually. As they became more accustomed to life in Woolpit, the children were able to communicate with the villagers in broken English. That's when they told their story, though. To be honest, it only raised more questions. They claimed to come from a land called St. Martin's Land, a place where the sun never rose, and the world was trapped in a constant, eerie twilight, a land separated from the people of Woolpit by a vast, fast-moving river. And according to the children, they didn't have the faintest idea how they ended up in Suffolk. One minute, they were tending their father's sheep in their homeland, and the next, they were in Woolpit, surrounded by people who didn't speak their language and had no idea what to make of them. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, that sounds like the setup to an alien encounter or a time travel story, you wouldn't be the only one. The bizarre nature of their arrival, the weird green skin, and their strange tale of a twilight world have led many to believe that the children might not have been children at all. Theories abound. Were they from another time, another dimension? Did they cross over from some sort of parallel universe where the rules of reality were completely different? Historians and folklorists have spent centuries trying to decipher the mystery of the green children of Woolpit. Some believe the kids might have been suffering from malnutrition, which caused their skin to turn green, after all. There are some medical conditions that can cause a slight greenish tint to the skin, especially if someone isn't getting the proper nutrients. But others think that their sudden appearance, their odd skin colour, and their strange mannerisms point to something far more mysterious. Could they have come from another world? Could they have somehow crossed over into our reality? As if this weren't enough, the children's story gets even stranger. When they were finally able to speak English, they revealed more details about their world things that seemed utterly impossible. For example, they claimed that in their homeland, the sun never set. This wasn't just a metaphor for a perpetually gloomy place. It was a claim of eternal twilight. Imagine living in a place where day and night blend together in a perpetual haze, where the sun never quite rises or falls. It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, but these kids were speaking about it as though it were the most normal thing in the world. But while some people are content to dismiss the whole story as a bizarre medieval legend, others have pointed out that there are strange similarities to otherworldly encounters in folklore. Are these children some kind of ancient time travellers? Are they the product of some lost civilization that lived under conditions so extreme they adapted in a way that is completely alien to us? Theories are as plentiful as the green beans they consumed, but the truth is we may never know. And then there's the really wild part of the story, the children's eventual fate. The boy, who had initially seemed to be in better health than his sister, died after a short period of time. His cause of death is still debated. Some believe he succumbed to the harshness of his new environment, while others suspect that it was just the toll of malnutrition and illness. His sister, however, grew stronger, and eventually she was able to integrate into the village's society. She learned the language, adapted to the local ways, and lived out the rest of her life in Woolpit. But no one really knows what happened to her once she became an adult, and no one can say with certainty where she came from or what became of her. To this day, historians and storytellers still wrestle with the mystery of the green children of Woolpit. Were they aliens, lost travellers from another time, or were they simply two children who had been displaced from their village, with their green skin caused by a rare condition that modern science still can't fully explain? We may never know, but that's part of what makes the story so haunting. It leaves us with more questions than answers. So now, as you sit there, absorbing this wild tale, remember history is full of bizarre stories like this, stories that make you wonder just how much we really know about the past. And while we may never uncover all the answers, one thing is certain: the world is far stranger than we give it credit for. Speaking of strange, let's shift gears again and look at something even more bizarre. Because if you think a pair of green children is the weirdest thing to come out of the past, you haven't yet heard the story of a king who tried to escape the grasp of death and ended up making a very big mistake. It's time to leave behind the mystery of the green children and dive into the world of royal blunders. Because, let me tell you, medieval kings had some wild ideas about how to escape death, and none of them had quite the same flair for disaster as King Zeno of Byzantium. Now, I know what you're thinking. A medieval king who tried to escape death. That sounds like a classic tale of arrogance and tragedy. Well, you'd be absolutely right. But what makes this story even stranger is how Zeno's escape from the afterlife involves something you might not expect: a terrible marriage, a hidden tomb, and a slow, agonizing death. Picture this: it's the late 5th century, and the Byzantine Empire is in the midst of a religious and political storm. Zeno, the emperor, has to deal with internal revolts, religious conflicts, and the usual intrigues of a royal court. So, as you might imagine, his life wasn't exactly smooth sailing. Now, Zeno wasn't just your average ruler. He had a knack for making enemies out of just about everyone, from the church to his political rivals. Everyone had a reason to dislike him, but even with all the chaos in his life, there was one thing Zeno could count on: his wife, Ariadne. Ariadne, the daughter of a previous emperor, was a political pawn in Zeno's quest for power. Their marriage had been arranged, and if we're being honest, it was more about securing political alliances than any deep romantic connection. Ariadne wasn't exactly thrilled about marrying Zeno, and it seems the feeling was mutual. This marriage would become central to Zeno's story, but not in the way he expected. You see, while Zeno may have had a knack for navigating court politics, he was less adept at keeping his own life intact. As Zeno's reign progressed, things only got worse. He faced religious revolts, political enemies, and a growing sense of dissatisfaction within his empire. It was a tense time to say the least, but things take a very dark turn in 491 when Zeno mysteriously dies. The cause of his death is unclear, but there are rumours that it was a result of excessive drinking. Some say that Zeno collapsed after one too many goblets of wine. But here's where it gets weird. He doesn't just die and get buried in peace. No. Instead, Zeno's death triggers a chain of events that you could call nothing short of ridiculous. You see, Zeno wasn't really dead. Well, not at first. According to the ancient historian John Zonarus, Zeno fell unconscious after drinking too much. So, at first, everyone thought he was just passed out. That's when the decision was made to bury him. No big deal. Right, just a drunk emperor who needed a little nap. But the problem is, when they tried to bury him, they didn't quite realise that he was still alive. And that, my friends, is where things get truly tragicomic. The night before his burial, Zeno woke up in a bit of a daze. He'd been drinking, so he didn't have a very clear understanding of what was happening around him. In his confused state, Zeno realised he was buried in a tomb, completely entombed in darkness. And what does a man do when he wakes up to find himself literally buried alive? He screams, he shouts for help, he begs for someone to open the tomb and let him out. But, unfortunately for Zeno, there's one small problem: his wife, Ariadne, has decided that she doesn't want him back. Now, this is where the funny part comes in. Remember, Ariadne's marriage to Zeno wasn't exactly filled with love and joy. So when she hears Zeno's cries echoing from the tomb, her reaction is something out of a dark comedy. Instead of rushing to her husband's aid, she lets him die a slow, agonizing death of dehydration and suffocation. That's right, Ariadne, who probably hadn't been thrilled with the idea of being married to Zeno in the first place, seals his fate by refusing to allow anyone to open the tomb. Imagine the scene: Zeno shouting, gasping for air, banging against the walls of his tomb, and Ariadne calmly standing outside, listening to him slowly perish. Historians are still debating why Ariadne allowed this to happen. Some say that she was simply tired of Zeno's reign and wanted to be rid of him once and for all. Others believe that it was a case of political manoeuvring after all. Zeno's death meant that Ariadne could now rule as regent for her son, the next emperor, but regardless of the reason, the fact remains that she let her husband suffer a slow, brutal death, all while she sat outside, as though it were some sort of punishment she felt he deserved. And here's the truly bizarre part after Zeno dies in this horrific, drawn-out manner. Ariadne orders that his body be buried again, not to rest in peace, but to keep up the appearance of a regal, undisturbed emperor. This leads to one of the most macabre, yet darkly humorous events in all of Byzantine history. As the story goes, after Zeno's death, Ariadne has her husband's body placed in a sarcophagus, where it was left to rot. But there's a twist. Zeno's body doesn't stay exactly in the grave. Historians claim that after his death, Zeno's body was moved, and there were even reports of people seeing him walking around the palace in ghostly form. His body was apparently taken out of its tomb, and some even claim that Ariadne had his body moved into a new sarcophagus, presumably to make it look like he was still alive. Whether this is just a bizarre rumour or a true account of the Byzantine court's strange practices is up for debate. What's clear is that the legend of Zeno's death, his burial, his resurrection, and his tragic end became a story so strange that it would be immortalised in the history of the Byzantine Empire. The emperor who tried to escape death ended up becoming a figure of both tragic and darkly comedic proportions. What does this say about the way people thought about death back in the medieval period? Well, death wasn't a simple, straightforward affair. It was messy, complicated, and often absurd. Even the best laid plans for avoiding death, like faking it, in Zeno's case, could lead to the most humiliating of ends. In the medieval world, death wasn't something you could easily escape from. No matter how much power you held or how many political machinations you employed, it was inevitable. And sometimes, death came in the most absurd ways. Zeno's story also brings to light just how much power the people around you could hold, even in the final moments of life. It was up to others like Ariadne to determine whether you lived or died, and whether your legacy would be remembered fondly or mocked forever. In Zeno's case, his death wasn't the end of his story. Instead, it became the stuff of legends. A tale of a man who tried to escape death but ended up being killed by his own wife's indifference. And now, as you sit back and think about the absurdity of it all, one man, drunk and confused, trying to escape his tomb, and his wife, the very woman he should have trusted. Letting him die, you can't help but laugh. Maybe not because it's funny in a traditional sense, but because it's tragic in the most ridiculous way possible. This was a man who fought for power, but in the end, it was his own wife who sealed his fate. It's a story of powerlessness, of how our lives can be directed by those who have the power to make life or death decisions. And in Zeno's case, he learned the hard way that sometimes death can be the least of your worries. Speaking of betrayals and absurdity, let's shift gears again. The next story is a bit of a palate cleanser, though it's still steeped in medieval oddities and bad decisions. It's the tale of an emperor who didn't quite understand the true nature of his own power, and it all ends in a way that will leave you shaking your head. If you thought the story of Zeno was strange, just wait until you hear about this emperor, whose unfortunate decision-making will make you wonder just how such bad judgment could have possibly been allowed to run an empire. This tale begins in the 12th century, and the protagonist is none other than King Henry II of Jerusalem, a ruler whose short life is more like a tragic comedy than anything resembling a dignified reign. But it's not just his life that's worth noting. It's the series of unfortunate events that led to his untimely demise. all of which stemmed from one rather unfortunate mistake, an event that, in retrospect, seemed inevitable. So, let's set the scene. It's the year 1192, and Henry, a French count turned king of Jerusalem, is in the midst of the Third Crusade. The crusade itself is a long and bloody affair, one that's been characterised by the sacking of cities, skirmishes with the Saracens, and the constant balancing act of maintaining loyalty among the Crusaders. Jerusalem, as always, is a hotly contested prize. The kingdom is in turmoil, but Henry, perhaps naively, believes that everything will be fine if he can just push through the chaos and secure some semblance of control. Now, Henry's journey isn't exactly the kind of tale you'd expect from a grand crusader king. His story starts, in a way, with a simple task to inform a rival about a political appointment. Henry's uncle, King Richard of England, sends him to the city of Tyre with an important message. He is to inform the newly elected king of Jerusalem, Conrad of Montferrat, about his new title. It's a simple mission, but it's one that would set off a chain of events that would eventually lead to Henry's tragic and utterly absurd demise. Upon delivering the message, Conrad is murdered, and here's where things get interesting, because within days of his death, Henry, ever the opportunist, has himself betrothed to Conrad's widow, the pregnant Queen of Jerusalem. Now, we're not just talking about a marriage for political gain here. This isn't some sterile diplomatic arrangement. Henry marries the widow with lightning speed, 8 days after Conrad's untimely death. To be exact, 8 days. Can you imagine? The ink on the papers isn't even dry, and he's already married to the widow of his political rival. It's a wild mix of convenience, ambition, and a little touch of unbelievable timing. This rapid marriage raised a lot of eyebrows. It was one thing to marry a widow, but quite another to marry her so soon after her husband's violent death, especially when you had every reason to suspect that the people might not take too kindly to this turn of events. Some accused Henry of playing a dirty game, taking advantage of a situation to secure his own claim to the throne of Jerusalem. But in the world of medieval politics, what else could you expect? Machinations, betrayals, and political manoeuvring were all in a day's work. But this decision to marry so quickly wouldn't be the end of Henry's problems. It would, in fact, be the beginning of a series of unfortunate events that would lead to a truly peculiar demise. Henry, now wed to the Queen of Jerusalem, is still far from secure. The Crusaders who once followed him are still skittish, and the political landscape is shifting beneath his feet. But Henry's not one to take things slowly. He moves quickly, just like he did when he married the widow. He throws himself into the kingdom's affairs with the fervour of someone who thinks he's playing a game of chess. But here's the thing. Not everyone is on board with Henry's rise to power. And when you're a king who rises to power by stealing another man's widow just days after his violent murder, you're bound to make some enemies. Henry's end comes in a manner so absurd that it borders on dark comedy. You know that feeling when you think you've dodged a bullet, only to walk straight into another one? That's Henry's fate in a nutshell. One day, as he stands sighing on a balcony of his palace, surveying the city, no doubt feeling pretty good about himself and the life he's built, disaster strikes in a way that you can only describe as tragic slapstick. The balcony collapses. Henry, the king, the self-proclaimed ruler of Jerusalem, plunges to the ground below, and in the process, he meets his untimely death. The most absurd part of all this is that, in the midst of his death, there's someone else who's getting the blame for the entire fiasco. His loyal servant, a dwarf named Scarlet, tries valiantly to catch Henry as he falls. Now, if you were Scarlet, what would you have done in that moment, I mean? Seriously, you're trying to save a grown man who's falling to his death from a balcony, and you're a dwarf. Scarlet does his best, grabbing hold of Henry's sleeve, trying to stop him from falling, but it's no use. The servant is too small, too weak, and before anyone can even process what's happening, both Scarlet and Henry fall to their deaths. Can you imagine that scene? A king falling to his doom, and his servant too, powerless to do anything but try to grab him. The irony is so thick, it practically begs for a medieval dark comedy script to be written about it. Now, for a moment, let's step back and think about the tragic comedy of it all. A man who was once king, who had moved mountains to secure his position, ends up dying in the most ridiculous way possible. No battle, no political assassination, no grand death by a sword or a dagger in the back. No, instead, it's a balcony collapse. And it's not even just the king who meets his end. It's the poor servant, Scarlet, who was just trying to help. The entire situation is so absurd that in the end, all you can do is laugh at the sheer irony of it all. It's almost like the universe itself decided, well, you can't take yourself too seriously when you're playing the power game. So, what does this story tell us about medieval rulers? It tells us that no one, no matter how much power or wealth you have, can escape the absurdities of fate. You can make all the clever political maneuvers you want, but in the end, gravity will always find a way to humble you. And for Henry, gravity had a very personal message, the moral of his tale. Sometimes the higher you climb, the harder you fall. And sometimes it's not even a rival's sword that gets you, it's just a poorly constructed balcony. Now, after all this talk of royal blunders, tragedy, and slapstick absurdities, let's shift gears for a moment. There's something else lurking in the background of medieval life that's just as peculiar: superstition. And when you think about the superstitions of medieval Europe, there's one thing you can be sure of: it's never just about one superstition. There's always something more. The next story will take you into the heart of one of the most strange and terrifying beliefs of the time, a belief that could literally ruin your life if you weren't careful. Ready? Let's dive into the eerie world of medieval superstition. But first, let's see if you can survive this. If there's one thing that's absolutely certain about the medieval period, it's that superstition ruled everything. If you thought superstition in the 21st century was out of hand, just wait until you hear what people believed back then. Imagine living in a world where every time you stepped outside, the air was thick with omens, warnings, and mysterious forces just waiting to mess with you. It wasn't just the occasional black cat crossing your path, or the fear of walking under a ladder. Oh no. The medieval period had its own unique, and sometimes outright terrifying, collection of superstitions that could literally shape your life for better or for worse. Let's paint the picture for you. You wake up in your humble medieval home, the morning is dim, and the scent of fresh bread wafts in from the hearth. You shuffle to the window, only to have your heart skip a beat. A bird just flew past, and it made a very specific kind of noise. For most people in the medieval world, that single event would be enough to send a chill down their spine. A bird flying by to us. That's a random occurrence, no big deal. But in medieval Europe, that bird's cry could mean death, or worse, disaster. Superstition wasn't just a quirky little belief, it was a life or death matter, a guiding force for everything from your farming practices to your marriage prospects. And let me tell you, it didn't take much for someone to curse you. Take, for example, the phenomenon of the evil eye. The belief in this terrifying force of malice was widespread during the medieval period, and for good reason. The evil eye wasn't just a metaphor for jealousy, it was an actual curse that could ruin your life. This belief was rooted in the idea that someone's envious glare could cause harm, whether it was illness, bad luck, or even death. Imagine walking down the street, minding your own business. When someone gives you a nasty look, you might think, oh, that person must just be having a bad day. But know back then, that look could be the start of your downfall. If you were unlucky enough to be the target of someone's gaze, there were no guarantees. You might get sick, or worse. You might fall victim to some other form of misfortune that seemed completely out of your control. Now, if you've ever seen a small child walk around with a little red ribbon tied to their wrist, or a person carrying a horseshoe for good luck, then you've seen remnants of medieval superstition in modern life. People in the Middle Ages truly believed that a simple glance could change the course of their lives. So they developed an entire arsenal of talismans and charms to protect themselves. There were all kinds of protective symbols, amulets, and rituals to ward off evil eyes, bad luck and curses. You might have worn a special necklace to guard against bad vibes, or carried a little bag of herbs to keep you safe from those nasty glances. But, of course, it wasn't just the evil eye that people feared. There was also the very real and incredibly eerie belief in spirits. According to medieval superstition, spirits weren't just figments of imagination or stories passed down from generation to generation. No, they were real, and worse. They were often angry. The idea that spirits could inhabit places and even objects was widespread, which means your own home could be haunted by something malevolent without you even knowing it. This wasn't like some ghost story to tell. Around the fire, these spirits were believed to be actively messing with your life, influencing your actions and causing harm. The famous tale of the black dog that's spectral. Black dog that would appear on foggy nights to lead you to your doom wasn't just a legend, it was a warning. People believed that seeing the black dog was a sign that death or misfortune was coming your way. So imagine it, you're sitting by your hearth, trying to enjoy a quiet evening, and suddenly you hear a tapping at the door. You open it, and what do you see? A shadow, a large looming figure in the distance. You feel a chill run down your spine, but you dismiss it until you hear the sound of footsteps getting closer. You look again, and there it is, the black dog, its glowing eyes staring straight at you. It's too late. The omen is set, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The black dog is a harbinger of doom, and if you see it, bad things are coming your way. But it wasn't just ghosts and evil eyes that made the medieval world a constant cause for anxiety and fear. One of the most enduring superstitions of the time was tied to omens, the belief that animals, weather, and even the position of the stars could signal something momentous or disastrous was deeply ingrained in medieval thought. People were constantly watching for signs from the heavens, interpreting dreams and even consulting soothsayers or wise women for guidance. The thing is, those omens were often contradictory, and they could easily cause hysteria. Let's talk about the weather for a moment. If you were living in the medieval period and you saw an eclipse, it wasn't something you'd just shrug off as a cool natural phenomenon. No, an eclipse was a warning. People believed that eclipses were signs that something terrible was about to happen. There were no scientific explanations for these events. So instead, the medieval mind filled in the gaps with apocalyptic theories. A solar eclipse. That was the sun losing its battle with dark forces. A lunar eclipse, a harbinger of doom. The sky turning dark in the middle of the day meant that something was going wrong in the world, something cosmic that couldn't be ignored. The same went for other types of weather. Thunderstorms. Those were signs of an angry god. If the wind blew in a certain direction, you could bet someone was bound to come up with an interpretation of it. Usually something ominous, if a rainstorm came out of nowhere. You might see the villagers scrambling to cover up their crops because they believed the rain wasn't just rain, it was a message. The world around them was speaking, and if they didn't listen carefully, they'd be met with disaster. And then, of course, there was death, and death in the medieval world was a constant. It wasn't just that people died, it was how they died, and when they died, that mattered. The medieval period was so steeped in the belief that death was part of an ongoing, cosmic battle between good and evil, that any sudden or unexpected death was seen as a message. If you died in an unexpected way, or if you died during a certain time of the year, or on a day when the planets were aligned in a specific way, well, that was an omen too, and these deaths were often explained away by superstitions, with explanations that were even stranger than you could imagine. This was particularly true for plague deaths. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, was an event that was not just a health crisis, but a spiritual one. People believed that the plague was sent by God as a punishment for sin. They believed that evil forces were at play, and the only way to survive was through spiritual purity. You could pray, fast, and engage in religious rituals, but if the plague came for you, there was little hope of escape. The sheer hopelessness of it all made people cling even more tightly to their superstitions. But if you didn't catch the plague, there were still other ways to die that were just as ominous, and these superstitions, as strange as they seem now, played a crucial role in shaping how people lived, how they interacted with the world, and how they understood their own existence. To be alive in medieval times was to live in a world full of ghosts, curses, omens, and bad luck. Your every move was being watched, whether by the heavens, spirits, or the evil eye. And that, my friends, was just part of everyday life. So, as you think about all of these superstitions, from the evil eye to the black dog, and consider how much they shaped medieval life, you can't help but marvel at the strange, chaotic world that people navigated. Sure, we might think they were misguided or just plain wrong about many of their beliefs, but at the time, these superstitions were a way of understanding a chaotic world. And as we head into the final section of our journey through medieval madness, we'll look at one last tale that brings it all together, the clash of old traditions and new beliefs, and how one emperor's foolishness led to the death of a truly legendary ruler. Ready? Let's dive into the ultimate medieval tragedy. The Middle Ages, the land of miracles, mysteries, and absolute mayhem. But no story could be more bizarre, creepy, and just downright weird than the tale of the nun who gave birth to a demon. Yes, you heard that right, a nun, in the 12th century, allegedly gave birth to an actual demon. Let's take a deep dive into the oddest birth you'll ever hear of. And yes, it's rooted in medieval superstition and hysteria. You might be thinking, wait, are we sure this is just a story? What kind of medieval hocus pocus was going on here? But back in the Middle Ages, the lines between belief, fear, and reality were blurry, to say the least. Anything could be considered possible, even something as outlandish as a nun becoming the mother of a hellish creature. The story starts with the nun living in a monastery, living a life dedicated to prayer, piety, and let's be honest, sacrifices. Nuns weren't exactly living the carefree, joyful lives of those outside the monastery. Their lives were filled with religious devotion and chastity vows. So, you can imagine the surprise when one day, a nun named Sister Agnes suddenly began showing signs of pregnancy. Now this alone was shocking. How could a nun, someone devoted to the church and taken vows of celibacy, suddenly be pregnant? The rumours quickly spread like wildfire throughout the monastery. Some people whispered it was a sign of divine intervention, while others suspected darker forces at play. There were even those who thought it might be some kind of punishment for the nun's sin, perhaps something she'd hidden from her fellow sisters. Gossip can work wonders in situations like this, don't you think? As the months went by, Sister Agnes's belly grew larger and larger, and the anticipation reached a fever pitch. The authorities were starting to get involved. This was no small matter. A pregnant nun wasn't just an anomaly, it was a scandal, one that had to be dealt with quickly. or else it might shake the very foundation of the monastery itself. And then the unimaginable happened. When Sister Agnes went into labour, the situation took an eerie turn. Instead of a typical newborn baby, she gave birth to something far more sinister, something the midwives and nuns in the room could barely comprehend. What emerged from Sister Agnes wasn't a human child, it was a demon. Yes, you read that correctly, a demon. The reports of the time, of course, these were written by people with strong religious biases, claimed that the creature had all the terrifying characteristics of a demon. It was said to have glowing red eyes, sharp teeth, and skin that looked like fire. Some even said it let out an unnatural screech, unlike any cry you'd hear from a newborn. Naturally, the moment this thing came into the world, the room was filled with chaos. The nuns screamed in horror, and Sister Agnes, exhausted from the labour, was reportedly too weak to move, and as for the demon, well, it simply disappeared after a few moments of terrorising the room. Historians still debate whether Sister Agnes truly gave birth to a demon, or if this was just a legend concocted by people who were terrified of something that couldn't be explained. But what's even more unsettling is the way the church reacted. While some of the monks and priests around the area tried to dismiss the event as an exaggerated tale or a fantasy created by a scared mind, there were others who believed that this was a true manifestation of evil. The story of Sister Agnes's demon birth quickly became a tale whispered about in hushed voices, passed down through generations, and recorded in various medieval chronicles. The event was so powerful that it lingered in the minds of people for years to come. The church itself became involved in examining Sister Agnes, trying to determine whether she was truly the victim of a demonic possession, or whether she had, in fact, been tempted by the devil. Some even claimed she had been secretly involved in witchcraft, and the pregnancy was the result of a dark pact with the devil. Others suspected that she had been tricked by a fallen angel, or worse, punished for something she had done before entering the convent. But as with most medieval tales, the story of the nun and her demon was filled with inconsistencies and mysteries. Was it all a fabrication, or did the power of medieval superstition cause everyone to believe in something so far-fetched that it became reality? The truth, as always, is elusive. Perhaps Sister Agnes was a victim of her time, a time when anything out of the ordinary was seen through the lens of the supernatural. Maybe she truly experienced something unexplainable, or maybe her story was a metaphor for the fears and superstitions of the era. Whatever the case, the story left a mark on the annals of history and has remained one of the most bizarre tales to emerge from the medieval period. But let's take a moment to think about what this story actually says about medieval society. In an era where piety was the ultimate virtue and women were often confined to roles of submission and devotion, the idea that a nun, someone supposedly beyond reproach, could give birth to a demon challenged the very foundations of society. It shook people to their core, revealing deep fears about women, the church, and the forces of evil that were believed to lurk in the shadows. It was a warning that in a time when faith and superstition were so closely intertwined, the line between good and evil could easily blur. But what happened to Sister Agnes after all of this? Well, legend says she was taken away and hidden from public view. Some believe she was sent to a remote convent to live out her days in solitude, away from the eyes of the world. Others say that the church, worried about the scandal she caused, silenced her for good. After all, a woman giving birth to a demon was one thing. A nun giving birth to one was a completely different beast. The church would have gone to great lengths to protect its reputation. And what better way to do that than by erasing someone who could ruin everything? And as for the demon itself, some say it disappeared into the night, a shadowy reminder of the terrifying powers lurking just beyond human understanding, whether it lived on in legend or simply faded into the unexplainable. The story of the demon child remains one of the most chilling and bizarre of medieval folklore. But as we wrap up this tale, it's hard not to feel a little more grateful for the modern age, where we no longer have to worry about birthing demons, strange omens, or accusations of witchcraft. Though, let's be honest, who wouldn't want a good medieval ghost story to keep things interesting from time to time? And with that, we come to the end of our journey through the dark, funny, and absolutely absurd tales from the medieval period. The Middle Ages were a time of superstition, chaos, and more than a little madness. But as we look back on these stories, we're reminded that, though things may have changed, the human capacity for bizarre events and wild imagination is timeless. Now, as you settle down for the night, perhaps with the faint echo of medieval laughter and horror still lingering in your mind, take a deep breath and remember history isn't just about dry dates and facts. It's about the strange, wonderful, and at times horrifying stories that shape who we are and where we've come from. And sometimes, those stories are so strange, so impossible, that they'll keep you up at night. Sweet dreams.